More and more countries across the global south are breaking diplomatic relations with Israel and accusing it of genocide against the Palestinian people. This is especially the case in Latin America, where numerous governments led by left-wing parties broke off relations with Israel. And the latest example is Nicaragua. The Sandinista government of Nicaragua has formally cut ties with Israel and has accused Israel of genocide, denouncing Israel as a fascist regime. And Nicaragua also expressed its full solidarity with Palestine. In the statement published on the 11th of October, the government of Nicaragua condemned what it called the, quote, brutal genocide that the fascist and war criminal government of Israel continues to wage against the Palestinian people, end quote. Nicaragua condemned, quote, the continued genocide, cruelty, extreme hatred, and extermination carried out by the government of Israel, reiterating the demand for compliance with all United Nations resolutions for the creation of the State of Palestine as a free, sovereign, independent, and self-determined state, end quote. And the Sandinista government of Nicaragua continued saying, quote, we condemn once again this genocide, the occupation, and the permanent aggression against the life and dignity of the people of Palestine, which is now expanding against the people of Lebanon and seriously threatening Syria, Yemen, and Iran, endangering the peace and security of the region and the world, end quote. And then Nicaragua emphasized its, quote, permanent solidarity with the people and government of Palestine, end quote. Now, it's not just left-wing governments in Latin America that are accusing Israel of genocide. Top experts at the United Nations, who are leaders in international law, have said very clearly that Israel is committing genocide and have demanded an arms embargo, although the United States has continued sending billions of dollars of weapons. In 1 year, the Biden-Harris administration sent Israel $18 billion of military aid. And the Israeli regime itself has been pretty blatant about its genocidal intentions. For instance, the far-right finance minister of Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, he openly said that the Israeli regime wants to starve the entire population of Gaza to death. I'm reading a report here from August in the mainstream media outlet The Times of Israel. It quoted Israel's finance minister, who complained that, quote, nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral, end quote. So this top official in the Israeli regime complained, saying, we want to starve every single Palestinian in Gaza to death, but the international community won't let us, he complained. So instead, Israel is going to bomb Gaza to smithereens, destroy every single person's house, liquidate entire families, which is what Israel has been doing with weapons and support from the United States and some European countries. And by the way, as for the accusation that the Israeli government is fascist, this is not just an insult that left-wing critics of Israel use. This has been acknowledged even by the most mainstream newspaper in Israel, Haaretz, which is a liberal Zionist newspaper. It's critical of Netanyahu, but it still upholds the Zionist settler colonial project. And this leading newspaper, Haaretz, has published many articles that say very clearly that Israel is run by a fascist regime. This is, again, a top Israeli newspaper that has been compared to the New York Times. It's often described as the New York Times of Israel. And as examples of the growing fascism inside Israel, Haaretz notes that left-wing journalists who have reported on the genocidal crimes committed by the Israeli regime have faced charges of treason, and media outlets in Israel have called for executing journalists who disseminate so-called defeatist propaganda, and they say that they should be executed for, quote, undermining the spirit of Israeli soldiers, end quote. So you're not allowed in Israel to report on the genocide that the Israeli fascist regime is carrying out against the Palestinians. But more and more countries around the world, especially in the global south, are very clearly saying this is genocide. This is precisely why in December of 2023, South Africa formally accused Israel of genocide in the International Court of Justice, which is the top UN legal authority. And this was deeply symbolic, of course, because South Africa, the black population, the indigenous population, was a victim of apartheid for decades through Dutch colonialism, a European colonial regime that imposed a white supremacist apartheid system on South Africa. And the Palestinian people today are suffering under a similar supremacist, racist, colonial system of apartheid imposed by the Zionist regime, which is a European colonial project like the Afrikaner regime in South Africa imposed by Dutch colonialism and British colonialism. And just a few weeks after South Africa introduced that case in the International Court of Justice, Nicaragua applied to officially join this case. Nicaragua also accused Israel in the International Court of Justice of carrying out genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, Nicaragua was the first country to join South Africa in this case at the ICJ, but since then, several more countries have joined. In fact, in October 2024, the leftist government in Bolivia, also in Latin America, joined the case as well. And thus far, the list of countries that have officially joined South Africa in this case accusing Israel of genocide in the International Court of Justice, those countries are Nicaragua, Colombia, Libya, Mexico, Palestine itself, Spain, Turkey, Chile, and the Maldives. Now you can see a very interesting trend here, which is that Latin America has helped lead the world in opposition to Israel's genocide and in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So in the past year, Nicaragua and Bolivia have cut off diplomatic relations formally with Israel, and Cuba and Venezuela, the leftist governments there, previously cut off relations with Israel. They do not have any formal relations. Furthermore, the governments of Colombia, Chile, Honduras, and Brazil have also recalled their ambassadors to Israel, so they don't have an ambassador there in protest. And Mexico has joined the case at The Hague accusing Israel of genocide. Now, it's not every government in Latin America. It's the left-wing governments, which are the majority of the governments in the region. The right-wing governments in Latin America are very closely allied with the United States and strongly support Israel. But the left-wing governments in Latin America, they have a history of being targeted by US imperialism for coups and military invasions and interventions and regime change. And they are tired of US meddling in their region, violating their sovereignty. And they have seen the same thing happen in Palestine and have shown solidarity with the Palestinian people and feel empathy as victims of colonialism by the Western powers. And that's why these left-wing governments in Latin America have been speaking out so forcefully against Israeli colonialism. And honestly, the Latin American left-wing governments have done exponentially more to support Palestine than most of the governments in the so-called Middle East, in West Asia, most of the Arab countries. Now, of course, there are the countries in the resistance, like Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon, who have defended Palestine. And then, of course, Iran is the leader of the resistance. Iran is not an Arab majority country. It's a Persian majority country. But the point is that the Arab countries around Israel, most of them have done basically nothing to help the Palestinian people, including the richest countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, these very rich Persian Gulf monarchies that make billions and billions of dollars every year selling oil and gas. They have done very little to actually support the Palestinians, whereas poorer countries relatively in Latin America are speaking out because it's the principled thing to do. Opposing colonialism and imperialism and genocide they don't get anything from it politically and certainly economically. They get threats of more sanctions and US interventions and attacks against their elected representative governments, but they know that it's the principled thing to do, and that's why they are supporting Palestine. Now, earlier I read part of the statement published by the government of Nicaragua announcing that it broke relations with Israel. And I want to also read a statement that was published by Nicaragua's democratically elected National Assembly, which is their version of their Congress, their legislature. This statement was only published in Spanish, but I translated it into English, and I want to highlight some of the main points. The Nicaraguan National Assembly condemned Israel's, quote, arrogance, cruelty, and extreme hatred against innocent families, mercilessly bombing civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, and homes, end quote. They said, quote, the genocide in Gaza represents undoubtedly the most detestable atrocity of the 21st century, end quote. And the Nicaraguan National Assembly, which in the National Assembly, the leftist Sandinista front is the biggest party. The National Assembly noted that there is an oligarchy, a capitalist oligarchy in the world. And they said that this, quote, world oligarchy that dominates Western governments and the media and international organizations that supposedly defend human rights hide the true dimension of the suffering and destruction of the Palestinian people, end quote. They referred to the government of Israel as the, quote, enemy of humanity. And they noted that Israel's crimes are being committed with, quote, the complicity and logistical and military support of the North American and European empires, end quote. And they referred to Israel as the, quote, tip of the spear, end quote, of the North American and European empires. So they're pointing out that Israel is a tool used by Western imperialism to try to control this region. And they pointed out that not only is the Israeli regime attacking the Palestinian people, it's also attacking Iran, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. And in this statement, the Nicaraguan National Assembly, in which the leftist Sandinista front is the majority, they talked about the history of Nicaraguan resistance against Western colonialism and imperialism, going back to indigenous leaders, and then the more modern resistance led by famous leaders like Carlos Fonseca, the founder of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or other leaders like Augusto Sandino, who fought against the US military occupation of his country, and his wife Blanca Raus. Also, revolutionaries like Rigoberto López Pérez, and past Nicaraguan revolutionaries and generals who fought against the US invaders, like, for instance, Andrés Castro and Benjamín Celedón. And the Nicaraguan National Assembly emphasized that these past heroes in the anti-colonial struggle in Nicaragua have shown, quote, with their anti-imperialist thinking and their liberatory actions, they inspire us to defend peace, sovereignty, self-determination, and solidarity among nations, end quote. And they emphasize that this is why Nicaragua has been standing in support of Palestinians and condemning Israeli colonialism. And it's why Nicaragua joined this case in the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. Now, these points are very powerful because they demonstrate the long history of shared struggle between the Palestinian people and, more broadly, the people of West Asia, and the struggles of people in Latin America, in Nicaragua and other countries that have been victims of first European colonialism and then US imperialism. The US, for instance, has militarily invaded and occupied Nicaragua 3 times, and then later the US empire propped up a far-right military dictatorship of the Somoza family in Nicaragua that ruled the country with an iron fist for decades, until in 1979, the people of Nicaragua overthrew this US-backed right-wing dictatorship, and they had a socialist revolution led by the Sandinista front. And ever since, the US empire has tried to crush the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. In the 1980s, the CIA-backed far-right death squads, the Contras, It's contrarrevolucionario is the name in Spanish, which means counter-revolution. So the CIA backed these counter-revolutionary death squads who burned down schools and hospitals in Nicaragua trying to just defeat the Sandinista revolution. And then in 2018, the US government backed another violent coup attempt against Nicaragua's democratically elected Sandinista government, trying to overthrow it. And now Nicaragua is under illegal, unilateral US sanctions, like the governments of Cuba and Venezuela, and the government of Iran, which also had a revolution in 1979. It was of a different political character. It was an Islamic nationalist revolution, but it was fundamentally an anti-colonial revolution, like many of the anti-colonial struggles across the global south. Like in Algeria, for instance, there are a lot of similarities between the Algerian revolution against French colonialism and the Iranian revolution against the US-backed puppet dictator, the Shah, who was installed in a 1953 coup orchestrated by the CIA that overthrew Iran's democratically elected left-wing prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil reserves. So the point is that there are many parallels in this history of anti-colonial struggle in Latin America and in West Asia of the Iranian people, the peoples of Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Lebanon, and of course, the people of Palestine. And in the case of Nicaragua, the Sandinista front has had for decades very close ties to the Palestinian struggle. In fact, during the armed struggle against the Somoza regime, this US puppet regime in the 1970s, there were Sandinista revolutionaries who trained with Palestinian revolutionaries fighting against Israeli colonialism backed by the US empire. And after the victory of the Sandinista revolution in 1979, there were Palestinians who got support from the Sandinistas in the 80s. And this is why this July 2024, the guest of honor at the anniversary honoring the 45th anniversary of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua was the Palestinian revolutionary leader, Leila Khaled. She was invited as the guest of honor. She sat next to Nicaragua's president, Daniel Ortega, and vice president, Rosario Murillo, and she gave a powerful speech honoring the Nicaraguan people and the revolutionary Sandinista struggle and their solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Vemos también cómo los imperialistas se ensañan en un pueblo que por acuerdos en los organismos internacionales, en Naciones Unidas, tiene derecho a ser un Estado, el Estado palestino, de un pueblo que está siendo sometido al genocidio, donde los niños están siendo asesinados todos los días, donde los jóvenes están siendo asesinados todos los días, y gobiernos europeos, el gobierno de Estados Unidos, reunidos en la OTAN, deciden todos los días darle cada vez más armas para que se sigan bombardeando al pueblo palestino. Y lo dicen claramente los gobernantes del Estado de Israel, que quieren que desaparezca el Estado palestino. Lo dicen sin ninguna vergüenza. La ley manda. Fue acuerdo de Naciones Unidas firmado por todos los países del mundo, entonces, que había que crear dos estados, el Estado de Israel y el Estado palestino. ¿Y qué dicen las autoridades de Israel? Que no debe existir el Estado palestino, que debe desaparecer porque es una amenaza para Israel. Si nos vamos con esa filosofía, habría que pedir la desaparición del Estado de la United States. El primero que debería desaparecer es ese Estado, que es el mayor criminal que tiene la humanidad. Y no solamente para andar asesinando a los pueblos, ocupando países como ha pasado aquí en Nicaragua, invadida por los yanquis.
And there is also another direct parallel between the Palestinian struggle and the struggle of Nicaragua against US imperialism and neocolonialism. And that is that in 1986, the International Court of Justice at The Hague officially ruled against the United States in favor of Nicaragua. And the International Court of Justice said that the United States violated international law and carried out acts of aggression against the people of Nicaragua after the CIA armed and trained the Contra death squads, after the CIA helped put mines in the civilian ports in Nicaragua that led to destruction of civilian infrastructure and deaths, after the CIA bombed Nicaraguan pipelines and civilian infrastructure. These were acts of war against the Nicaraguan people carried out by the United States. And that's why the ICJ said that the U.S. violated international law, and the ICJ said that the U.S. owes the people of Nicaragua reparations. That was in 1986. The U.S. government ignored the ruling, and it used its power in the Security Council to prevent that ruling from being implemented. The U.S. has veto power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So the U.S. government is a rogue regime, like the Israeli rogue regime. They spit in the face of international law. They spit in the face of the International Court of Justice at The Hague. And now we see that the Palestinian people are seeking justice after Israel has carried out genocide against them, just like the Nicaraguan people have sought justice for the crimes committed against them. And the U.S. has refused for decades to honor this ruling. It has refused to pay reparations to the people of Nicaragua. This is the true face of Western so-called democracy. This is the true face of what Western governments refer to as their rules-based international order, in which they make the rules and order everyone around. And they carry out genocide and crimes against humanity, and they face no consequences because they created this system in a way that gives them veto power. They control this system, and that's why so many countries in the Global South in particular they're fed up, and they are rising up. They are rebelling against Western imperialism, this international dictatorship controlled by the US and its European allies, and these Global South countries that represent the global majority. They represent 86% of the world population. The West only represents 14% of the world population. And we can see that countries like Nicaragua, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, or countries like Venezuela and Cuba and Bolivia, they are at the vanguard of this international struggle against Western imperialism and neocolonialism. They're at the vanguard of this struggle for international democracy and multipolarity. And these are the things that we talk about regularly here at Geopolitical Economy Report. So if you like the work that we do, please like and subscribe. Please share this. And please come back soon for more reporting. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.